So we're talking about Gilly Drury's book, Global Elitism, and how that connects to comparative international education, and how we can think of that from perhaps a sociological perspective with social and cultural roots. And I mentioned in the last screencast that the way that I'd like to do this is I'd like to introduce or at least discuss three macro-sociological perspectives: the functional, the conflict, and the institutional. And you can see that they have various different names. These are just some of the other ways that they're known here. And I think that it's important to discuss these three macro-sociological perspectives because they each are connected to one another. They all basically are functional theories. Conflict and institutional are just forms of functional theories. And they also all relate very strongly to issues of inequality or stratification or differentiation that we discuss in sociological studies more broadly. And I think that that's important as well because I know that Gilly Drury comes from a sociological background as well. So this will maybe help us think about globalization and educational inequality or equality or inequity, or however we want to say it, from a perspective that will align somewhat with Drury's perspective. Perhaps all of you or some of you have a sociological theoretical background already. In case you do, awesome. You will bring a lot to this discussion that maybe others can't. In case you have not, that's fine as well. That's why I'm here to talk about this. But I'm also going to be explaining this from a comparative and international education perspective. So blending that sociological and that CIE perspective into a theoretical framework for us to begin thinking about globalization and educational equity as it relates to digital technology as we move forward. So what is a functional macro-sociological theory? Well, there are a couple of basic ideas that go along with sociological functionalism that I think we have to address. And one is that, like living organisms, all societies possess basic functions which they must carry out to survive. So the idea is that society is like a living organism, right? It has to reproduce itself. It has to recruit or produce new members. It has to distribute goods and services, and it has to allocate power. Right? These are things that all societies do. These are things that are necessary for a social community, whatever, to survive. And so they are things that are specifically addressed by a functional perspective. Now, the way that social transmission occurs, right, the way that these things happen is through socializing institutions like families, churches, and schools. Right? And the idea is that individuals then accept their roles within the social structure, within this living organism that is society, because of the impact of families, churches, and schools, and other institutional social institutions like this. Now, the fact is that society is made up of different parts, social parts, if you will, and they exist largely due to either internal or external needs. The internal needs are that the system will not stay together by itself, but that it requires maintenance. And people are born into the system or they migrate into it, but either way, the system requires internal maintenance. External needs suggest that the demands of other societies, or technological, or environmental, or population demands, will change somehow the way that the society exists. Now, we are specifically talking about technological demands, or technological things that happen with Drury's Global Elitism book. So we have to remember, though, that there is a bit of a balance between the internal and the external. And on the one hand, we've got the people within the system that are requiring certain things to happen in order for the system, the society, to be maintained. On the other hand, we have external needs, such as those developed by technology, which may not be inherent to a particular society or social system, but are going to significantly impact how that system works. Now, the parts of any system interact with one another, and this interaction produces a dynamic, ever-changing system, and this is important to recognize. The system does not achieve stasis or homogeneity. It is dynamic and it is always changing. Let me give you a very blunt family school example. When schools change the class time schedule based on some sort of curricular idea, in other words, transitioning from a traditional 6-period schedule to a block schedule where there may only be 3 classes per day, but they only last 1 semester, the outcome will have an impact on the family structure. Right? Because family, school, economy, religion, politics, you name it. Think of another sort of social institution. It all works together as a system, right? All of it works together as a system. So whenever something in the school changes, it's going to impact the family. Whenever something in the family changes, it's going to impact the school. Right? And we could use these other examples as well. They're all part of what goes on here. I'm just focusing on family and school right now for the purposes of our example. But if we wanted to put technology as another part of the system, well then when technology changes, that's going to affect the school. That's going to affect the family. That's going to affect the economy and religion and politics and everything else. Now, how does change occur in a functional, from a functional perspective? Well, change occurs when there is either imbalance or disequilibrium. In other words, a gap between what the system does and what it, I'm going to put quotes here, needs to do. Right? Because those needs can also be perceived needs. They don't have to be real needs. All right, so the structure and function of the societal parts adjust to meet those needs, which is what produces social change. And at a micro level, we experience this as changing roles and expectations for action. So, for example, we're doing this right now through technology. You're watching a screencast, right? If this did not exist, if we did not have this way of doing things, then there would be no expectation regarding that. But once technology like this was introduced into the system, that created a disequilibrium. 20 years ago, if class was canceled because of the hurricane, we would have just said, well, class is canceled. Right? But instead now, we have this gap. We have this technology available, and that creates an imbalance. We can't say, well, we can't throw our hands up in the air and say, well, we're not going to do this. We say, well, we have alternatives to doing this, and so we move forward with those alternatives. Now, there's some famous functionalists from sociological theory that you may have heard of before. One is Emile Durkheim. Here he is. Emile came up with the idea that education everywhere creates moral unity for social cohesion and harmony. Right? Social cohesion and harmony. Big statements that education is a moral endeavor. He created the idea that consensus is the normal state in society. Consensus, right? Everybody agreeing, or at least the majority agreeing, that a particular thing is normal. Right? This is where we get the ideas of legitimacy. Now, what is the consensus about what is normal or expected? And that whenever there is conflict, that represents a breakdown of shared values rather than a positive way to move forward and make change. In other words, disequilibrium or imbalance was a bad thing, according to Emile Durkheim, because that was a breakdown of our values. It may promote change, but it was a breakdown. Other big famous functionalists are folks like this American Talcott Parsons, who said that education is the secondary agent of socialization, with family being the primary agent. In other words, one of the key, or maybe the key function of education isn't necessarily the content that people learn or the knowledge and skills about the content, but it's being socialized into the larger community. He also argued that schools operated on meritocratic principles. Meritocratic means that you earn what you get, or you get what you deserve, and those who work harder should go farther in schools. Right? We know that this is not completely accurate. I'm being a little sarcastic here, right? Because there are plenty of studies that show that people who deserve, I'm using air quotes even though you can't see me, deserve more don't get it through schools. And then finally down here, I know you can't see it because it's been cut off by the screen, but it says role allocation. So Talcott Parsons suggested that schools allocate people to different roles in society. You would hope that those roles for yourself would be something bigger or larger or greater or powerful. But the fact of the matter is, he said, and this was the first sort of hint at this, that schools reproduce a lot of what happens within society, but that if people worked hard enough, right, they could maybe bust beyond that and get something greater. All right, so we have to ask, what was he thinking? Because we know that that doesn't always happen that way, right? However, He is one person who sort of established this foundation for what sociological functionalism was and how we can think about schools as a result of that. So, schooling serves to reinforce the existing social and political order because, remember, imbalance is bad, status quo is good from a functional sociological perspective. Right? So anytime there is change, we're moving out of the existing social and political order, and that's because of imbalance. He suggests, or sociological functionalism suggests that social systems are benign and existing class structures are appropriate. Right? Not necessarily good or bad, but appropriate. In other words, all the things we're talking about, stratification, differentiation, and inequality, exist because they serve a social function. Somebody has to do all of the different jobs in society. And if you think of society as a body, right, here we go, arms, legs. If you think of society as a body, you know, what are the key ones? Well, the heart and the brain can be considered pretty appropriate, but somebody has to be the foot, and somebody has to be the, I don't know, the ear, and somebody has to be the knee, somebody has to be the liver, somebody has to be the stomach. Right? Not everybody can be the heart or the brain. So, the social system itself is just like a living organism. It's benign, and those differences between the heart and the brain and the foot and the knee and the liver and etc., those are appropriate for the functioning of society. And we should not try to have a society full of brains, because if that happens, then it can't eat, it can't pump blood, it can't move around, right? There's problems. Schooling purposes are then intellectual, political, economic, social, you name it. It serves all sorts of purposes. So schools are not just for the transmission of knowledge and skill, academic content. They are for socialization. They are for developing political and economic communities. There are all sorts of things that result from that. Right? And I'm going to slip past all of these because I don't think we need to discuss them quite as much. So if we go to the end here, education reform then, from a sociological functional point of view, should create structures, programs, and curriculum that are technically advanced, rational, and encourage social unity. And that if there are any problems in society, they may be due to educational inadequacies. And so we can have social reform through education, because education serves to socialize. All right, there's one perspective. Now, if we think of our digital technology, our global elitism approach that we're getting from Drury, if we were to say that technology is somehow serving a functional purpose, then its point should be to encourage social unity, but also, let me go back to also this one, but also to reproduce existing class structures. Because that's what's appropriate. Because if we can't go changing the way the living organism works. Society is a living organism. We cannot all bunch up into one role. We have to have different roles. And it is moral and right to differentiate that way, as our friend Emile Durkheim suggests. All right, we'll come back and we'll talk about the other two macro-sociological perspectives in relation to globalization, educational equity, and digital technology.